Welcome back for lesson 3. We're going to be talking about Northeast Africa today, and we're going to look at two places, ancient Egypt and Nubia, and we're going to learn more about civilization there. And before we get started, I want you to think about common characteristics of a civilization. We've been talking about these common characteristics of civilizations for the last two classes. One example is food surplus, another is accumulated knowledge. Can you name some of the other common characteristics in a civilization? And as we move forward and start talking about ancient Egypt and Nubia, can you pinpoint some of these things that would make it a civilization? So we're going to look at ancient Egypt and Nubia today. Our objectives are to explain the impact of the geography of ancient Egypt, including the flow of the Nile River and the divisions of Upper and Lower Egypt. Know the significance and major features, including architecture, important persons, politics, and agriculture of the following periods of Egyptian history: pre-dynastic, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. Discuss Egyptian spiritual beliefs, pay particular attention to the role of the afterlife. We'll also be looking at religion in Egypt, including several deities and burial rites. Describe the importance of writing in Egypt, offering details on hieroglyphics and their translation. So we're going to look at ancient Egypt is a complex society. It is influenced by its cross-cultural connections, and we also know the people in ancient Egypt are able to adapt to environmental changes, and they're actually even able to control some of their environment. They develop sophisticated politics and polytheistic religion. But to really understand ancient Egypt, we have to look at the Nile River. The Nile River is the center of Egyptian culture. It flows a total of 4,132 miles from the Sudan to the Mediterranean Sea. If we look closer at the Nile, it actually starts when two rivers flow together, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The White Nile starts out in the Great Lakes region of East Africa and flows to the Sudan, and the Blue Nile starts in the Ethiopian highlands and flows to the Sudan. When they meet together, they form the Nile River. The Nile River, as I said, flows from the Sudan to the Mediterranean Sea. It flows in a pattern south to north. If you're from the United States, you may think of a river like the Mississippi River. It actually flows north to south. But the Nile River is different. It flows south to north. So the upper Nile is actually in the south, and the lower Nile is actually toward the north. So the flow is different. It's south to north. The way the wind flows, it actually works against the flow of the river. The wind flows north to south. So this actually facilitates some trade. But to understand the way that the Nile defines Egypt, it actually breaks Egypt up into two sections, Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is actually in the south. Lower Egypt is in the north. Another thing to note about the Nile River is it has cataracts. And if you get a chance, go Google the first cataract on the Nile River and see what it looks like. Cataracts were impassable by boats, and the Nile River has areas with shallow areas, rocks, and rapids. So, in some places, the Nile is very hard to navigate, but the people are able to use the Nile to transport goods. So, let's talk a little bit more about how the Nile River facilitates civilization. The Nile River has yearly floods that replenish the soil. They are predictable floods that occur each summer, and they replenish the nutrients of the soil. They are more predictable than the floods in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So they're very, very predictable. And these floods protected the Egyptians from starvation. They knew that they could plant wheat and barley along the floodplains of the Nile River, and they did not starve. They were able to use this for agriculture. There were other uses of the Nile River as well. It provided a source of protein. Birds flew routes along the Nile River, and they were able to hunt these birds, but the Nile River also has fish. So there are forms of protein that the ancient Egyptians were able to get along the Nile River, as well as grow agriculture along the Nile River and the floodplain. The Nile River also provided transportation for ancient Egyptians, and transportation helped with trading as well. And trading is part of being a civilization. It's one of those common characteristics of a civilization. Another thing that the Nile area will provide the Egyptians with is papyrus, and papyrus will lead to paper. And the Egyptians do use papyrus because they do have a written language, and we're going to talk more about this written language in this lesson. Before pre-dynastic Egypt, Egypt had some environmental changes. What happened? Around 7000 BCE, ancient Egyptians began to cultivate wheat and barley, and they also began to keep domestic animals. They were even herding sheep and goat in the Sahara Desert. It was a period that was much wetter, so the Sahara Desert was actually able to maintain these sheep and goat herds. But there were some environmental changes. There was a drying out period, and the Sahara Desert emerges. So by 5000 BCE, it's no longer possible for these ancient Egyptians to farm much beyond the floodplains of the Nile River. So people start moving toward the Nile River. By about 3600 BCE to 3300 BCE, there are complex societies that were forming in areas around the Nile River. So this leads us to pre-dynastic Egypt from 3500 BCE to 2800 BCE. There is social stratification and social differences and labor specializations in pre-dynastic Egypt. There are settlements in Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So there's an upper kingdom centered near the city of Luxor, and there's a lower kingdom centered in the Nile Delta. During this time period, about 3500 BCE, these ancient Egyptians are using methods to clear more land, and they're able to support about 1,000 people per square mile. So the society is becoming more complex. Egyptians are developing more advanced tools and agriculture during this pre-dynastic time period, and their culture is expanding along the Nile River. Egyptian religion will really begin to develop during this time as well, and we'll see a polytheistic religion emerge. The Egyptians are really exploring this area around the Nile River during the pre-dynastic era, and they're exploring over 600 miles of the Nile, and like I said, they're clearing more land around the Nile River. Eventually, an Egyptian king named Namar Menes unified the upper and lower kingdoms around 3150 BCE and 3100 BCE, and he actually sets up the first dynasty. But the pre-dynastic Egypt will continue to around 2800 BCE. When it ends, we will see this dynastic Egypt emerge. So let's talk a little bit about dynastic Egypt. When we're talking about dynastic Egypt, there are three main kingdoms, and we're going to focus on them. They're the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is from 2660 to 2160 BCE. It will be the first one we talk about. But all three of these kingdoms have common characteristics. And it's called dynastic Egypt because there are dynasties, they're pharaohs. So there's this continuity and common characteristics in all three of these periods, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. They have a stable population. They have social stratification, so they're different classes, and people have different jobs. So there are specialized laborers, and then there are not specialized laborers. There's pharaohs. Of course, they're going to rule the kingdoms. They have a unifying religious ideology, and most of the time it is going to be polytheistic. There is an exception to that rule, and we'll get to that. And they have tax collection. And the last thing that I would say about dynastic Egypt is there is relative equality for women and men. Women had considerable legal rights and freedoms in dynastic Egypt or ancient Egypt. They did have different roles defined by gender roles. The men's provided for family while women managed the home and children. But, like I said, there is a relative equality between women and men because women do have some legal rights and freedoms. There are three kingdoms of Egypt: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. In between those kingdoms, sometimes there are intermediate periods, and we'll talk more about that as we move forward. We're going to first talk about the Old Kingdom that lasts from 2660 BCE to 2160 BCE. During this time period, pharaohs built pyramids. They built these pyramids to emphasize their relationship with their divine gods and to help their bodies ascend to gods after death. These pyramids are often tombs for pharaohs and their wives, and Egyptians during this time period, especially wealthy Egyptians and especially the pharaohs, they were mummified after death and they're buried with everything. An example of pyramids are the pyramids at Giza. There are actually 3 of them, and the 3 pyramids at Giza are built for Khufu and his son and his grandson. The Great Pyramid of Giza was for Pharaoh Khufu, and it's still intact today. It took 20 years to build. It's over 500 feet high. It was constructed with 600 tons of limestone. Skilled craftsmen planned this pyramid out, and they used unskilled labor, so this shows their social stratifications during the Old Kingdom. There was no standing army during the Old Kingdom, but there was a lot of trade. The pharaohs during the Old Kingdom controlled trade with Nubia and other areas surrounding Egypt. But they're going to trade. They'll export grain and later gold, and they'll import goods like timber, spices, ivory, and luxury goods. But over time, the power of the Old Kingdom begins to decline during the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. The reason is because there were environmental changes, including a drought and a famine. Also, because the pharaohs had appointed governors in Egypt's 42 provinces. And over time, by this 5th dynasty, these provinces had become more independent, and the pharaohs had lost control over trade in many of these provinces. So by 2180 BCE, there was a lack of central control. These provinces were kind of doing what they wanted to do. The pharaohs during the 5th dynasty were losing control. And so this leads to the first intermediate period. So at the end of the Old Kingdom in 2160 BCE, there's this first intermediate period that basically the pharaohs don't have control. They have a lack of authority. And it will be when the Middle Kingdom emerges that the pharaohs take back control. So before we talk about that, we want to look at religion during the Old Kingdom and look at more about the Old Kingdom. So religion in the Old Kingdom, the Egyptians during the Old Kingdom were polytheistic. They believed in more than one god and they worshiped more than one god. And these are actually some examples of their gods that they worship. One of the most famous gods is Ra, the sun god. You also have Isis, which is for fertility, Set for evil. But there are other lesser gods that serve as local village gods or deities. Now, the Egyptians do believe in the afterlife. They believe that life after death was seen as a reward. This is very different from the Mesopotamians. Remember, the people that lived in Mesopotamia, they saw the afterlife as gloomy. You read the Epic of Gilgamesh in Lesson 2, and they really talked about it being gloomy. Well, the Egyptians don't. They see it as a reward. And the pharaoh or the king would even become a god. The Egyptian people had specific burial rituals to prepare body for the afterlife, especially for the elites like the pharaoh. The pharaohs would fill their tombs with their favorite possessions and wine cups. They would really be preparing for the afterlife. The pharaohs and their wives and family members, their bodies were embalmed and mummified to preserve their bodies. They also had statues placed in their tombs to serve as receptacles for their spirit if their mummy became damaged. And we know more about Egyptian beliefs on death and afterlife because they left behind the Book of the Dead, and it provides specific instructions for burial and the path to the afterlife. So it tells us a lot about that. The Egyptians also have this concept of Ma'at, which means literally translates to right order, but it's about their morality, their ethical qualities, and righteousness and rightness. And so they believe that people should follow the right order. So these are some of the religious beliefs in the Old Kingdom. Ancient Egyptians did have writing. We know more about them because they did leave behind writings. Their writing actually developed because the pharaohs needed information about tax assessment and collection. It really led to the initial development of hieroglyphics. There are actually 3 parts of hieroglyphics: the phonograms, the ideograms, and the determinatives. But we're able to understand these hieroglyphics because Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1798, allowed researchers to translate these hieroglyphics, and it let archaeologists understand them. better. So they have three different components: the phonograms, their pictorial symbols that represent sounds, ideograms are pictorial signs that represent an entire idea, and then they're determinatives that are unspoken but give context. They do not have vowels. So hieroglyphics were used by ancient Egyptians, but often it was only by literate elite and skilled craftsmen. Ink and papyrus was used only for official records and very special records. Literate people used broken pottery and chips of limestone to take notes and for communication purposes. So they did have a written language, but not everybody in ancient Egypt was literate. The literature in ancient Egypt focuses on myths, the afterlife, and religion. We saw an example of this in the previous slide. They have the Book of the Dead that talks about burial practices, and it also talks about the afterlife. Other subjects in ancient Egyptians' writing include war victories and wisdom and proverbs. But these ancient Egyptians learned a lot. They did have accumulated knowledge, which is a common characteristic of a civilization. They also focus on mathematics and medicine. Egyptians were inventors of applied science. They had tools like ramps and levers. They planted along the Nile River, which led to mastery of arithmetics, geometry, and surveying. The pyramids really show us how they were able to master mathematics. They could not have been built without a mastery of mathematics, and they had to use this mathematics to build the pyramids to make sure all the angles were correct. But they were very skilled in arithmetics and geometry. They also had medical practices. Medicine was based on driving demons out of the body during this time period, but some of their ideas still provide a basis for modern medicine. The Egyptians performed triage. They determined if a disease was curable, treatable, or a terminal condition. And they also attempted to diagnose illnesses. They actually identified 48 different medical problems still recognized today. They also participated in medical procedures to heal bones and relieve fever. So they were advanced, and they continued to learn and build their knowledge and pass it down through accumulated knowledge. The Old Kingdom begins to decline by 2160 BCE, and after the Old Kingdom declines, it really falls into this period called the Intermediate Phase, and that lasts until about 2000 BCE. And there's this time where there are still pharaohs from the Old Kingdom, but they lack authority and they lack control over the territory that they once had. There are famine, civil war, and lack of trade during this time, but the last recognized Old Kingdom pharaoh was a man named Pepi II. After this Old Kingdom and this first intermediate period falls away, we get to the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom lasts from about 2040 BCE to 1640 BCE, and the leader that really brings about this Middle Kingdom and reunification is a man named Mentotap II. He reunifies Egypt and declares that pharaohs are living gods. He also focuses on moving the capital from Thebes to List, and this would be in between Upper and Lower Egypt, so he could keep an eye on both. He also focuses on expanding north to Lebanon and south to the Second Cataract of the Nile and Nubia. He wanted to access more trade. During the Middle Kingdom, you will see a lot of expansion and reorganization where merchants paid taxes to the state, the administration was reorganized, and the Middle Kingdom had military expeditions, and they focused on repairing state infrastructure. Over time, there are some disputes over who will become the next pharaoh, so succession, and there also are some ineffectual rulers in the Middle Kingdom. It will actually lead to a decline, and it will allow outside invaders to attack the Middle Kingdom. Around 1720 BCE, a group of people known as the Hyksos invaded Egypt and destroyed the Middle Kingdom. They brought with them bronze and chariots, horse-drawn chariots. They had bows and axes, and it really allows them to conquer part of Lower Egypt for at least 100 years. Egyptians eventually defeat the Hyksos around 1570 BCE, and it will lead to the New Kingdom. So between the Middle Kingdom and this New Kingdom is this second intermediate period. The second intermediate period is when the Hyksos control most of Lower Egypt. So let's talk about the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom really begins after the second intermediate period. It begins in 1530 and lasts until 1070 BCE. In 1530 BCE, there's a reunification of Egypt led by Ahmose the Liberator. He's actually able to defeat the Hyksos, and he starts focusing on imperialism, taking more territory. By 1500 BCE, the Egyptian army had pushed into Nubia, Kush, and southward to the fourth cataract of the Nile. And so during the New Kingdom, there is imperialism. Imperial Egypt pushed into Palestine and Syria, and they were really spreading their territory. By pushing into Kush, they were able to control trade routes in sub-Saharan Africa and gain access to new metal technologies. During the New Kingdom, pharaohs had large standing armies. There were also slaves in the New Kingdom. And early on, religion focused on emphasizing unity and harmony, and they were still polytheistic. But eventually, we get to the Amarnia period and a new ruler, Akhenaten. Originally, the pharaoh was called Amenhotep IV, but he renames himself Akhenaten, and he actually changes religion in ancient Egypt during the New Kingdom. Up to this point, we've been talking about the Egyptians being polytheistic. They believe in more than one god. Well, Akhenaten wanted to create a state-sponsored monotheism, so he wanted to focus on one god. And this one god was called Aten, and he was seen as the creator and associated with the sun. So it's really a combination of Amun and Ra. Ra was the sun god. And so people really get upset about this. The pharaoh really wanted to break with the priests and thieves because he thought they were so powerful. He even claims himself that he was the son of Aten, and a lot of Egyptians saw this in a troubling light. They really did not like the way that he was acting, and so a lot of people get mad, and eventually he is murdered in a palace coup, and this is known as the Marian Revolution. By 1323 BCE, Amarnia is destroyed and a new king is in place. He's called King Tut. King Tut will actually come in and undo all of the changes that Amenhotep IV had done, such as monotheism, so they're going to go back to polytheism. If we look at King Tut, he didn't really rule for a long time. He was fairly young when he passed away. We know a little bit more about King Tut because his tomb was found mostly intact in 1922. It actually told us more about the religion during this time period. But he does not rule for a very long time. A lot of the kings during this new kingdom are actually buried at a place called the Valley of the Kings. It was actually the preferred burial sites because they wanted hidden tombs that would hide the pharaohs away from robbers. And King Tut's tomb is actually fairly intact when it is found in 1922. But there were also some very powerful leaders after King Tut. Two of those very powerful leaders are the Pharaoh Ramses I and Pharaoh Ramses II. And they're very powerful leaders in the New Kingdom. They actually expanded central administration and expanded the empire. But we know after them, by the 12th century BCE, there were weaker leaders and invasions from the outside and a loss of territory, especially Nubia and Palestine. So there's a collapse of the New Kingdom. So we've talked about these different kingdoms, the Old Kingdom, and in between that was this first intermediate period. And then we had the Middle Kingdom and the second intermediate period, and now we're at the New Kingdom, and there will be a third intermediate period. But these are the three kingdoms of dynastic Egypt that we've talked about, and we're going to turn and look at Nubia for just a moment. So separate from Egypt is Nubia. We're going to be looking at two kingdoms, the kingdom of Kerma and Kush. But before we do that, I want to tell you where Nubia is located. It's actually located at the first cataract of the Nile, and Nubia is a site of early civilization. If we back up and look again at the time when the Sahara Desert was drying, between 5000 and 4000 BCE, we see a lot of people began cattle farming, and a cattle culture develops around Nubia. The kingdom of Kerma emerges by 2400 BCE and it lasts to 1500 BCE. Kerma was located in Upper Nubia, and there was also a capital city, Kerma. We know that Kerma focused on agriculture and trade. Some of the agriculture they participated in was growing barley, and they kept goats, sheep, and cattle. They really continued this cattle culture. The people that lived in the kingdom of Kerma sent tribute to the capital city, and we also know that they were participating in mining, metalwork, and pottery in the kingdom of Kerma. Some of the trade that they were trading for was gold, copper, slaves, ivory, and exotic animals. They imported textiles, jewelry, and other goods. If we look at structures from this time period, we're able to see some of these structures still standing. An example is the Western Defufa, and it's mud bricked, and we believe it's likely a temple for these people. Another thing that we know is there is an Eastern cemetery from the kingdom of Kerma. There were 30,000 tombs, and the tombs tell us about the people. There were human sacrifice and wealth and statues located within these tombs. The largest tomb was 300 foot, and it was covered in black granite with white quartz and a marble top. Kerma really thrived when Egypt was at its weakest. It thrives during Egypt's second intermediate period, and Kerma uses this to increase its power and invade parts of Upper Egypt. But once Egypt reunifies, Egypt was able to conquer Kerma, and the Egyptians are able to occupy the four cataracts for the next 500 years. So that's the end of the kingdom of Kerma, and we'll look at the kingdom of Kush. The last kingdom we're going to talk about today is the kingdom of Kush. It's in Nubia. We see the rise of the kingdom of Kush during Egypt's third intermediate period, so after the new kingdom collapses. The kingdom of Kush really develops because Nubians want independence from Egypt, and they develop around the 8th century BCE. They have a capital called Napata, and it's created around 750 BCE, but as their leaders begin to take over Upper Egypt, they decide they want to move their capital to Thebes, and they start something called the Ethiopian dynasty, and they ruled from Thebes. But eventually there's an Assyrian invasion that will destabilize these Ethiopian rulers in Thebes, and it will push them back into Nubia and into the city called Napata, the original capital, and they're there for a period of time, but eventually Napata is destroyed in 593 BCE, and so Kush has to move its kingdom's capital to a place called Meroe, and it flourishes there. There's actually more diverse agriculture there because it was well-watered farmland. They're able to grow more things. They have wider crop diversity, including cotton, sorghum, and millet, and their cattle industry increases. And they're also able to have more religious autonomy. It's not so closely tied to other people's religion. They establish their own Nubian war god, the Lion of the South. They also mined for gold and created their own script, so their own writing is named after their city, and so for that reason it's called Meroic script. And so these people flourish. They have iron tools and weapons, and they're able to really develop their own style. They even have their own pyramids. Here's an example of some of the pyramids that they're able to build. They're smaller than the Egyptian pyramid, and they have their own unique shape. Some of the people that are buried there are not always mummified, but they were buried in the fetal position. So we know that they definitely have their own culture there. We have not yet been able to translate their scripts. Eventually, over time, the Greeks and the Romans would raid Nubia, and there was an abrupt collapse due to several things, including the environment and internal rivalries and the rise of another power in the 4th century BCE. And this is where I'll leave off as we've talked about ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia. In lesson 4, we'll talk about the Israelites.